The floating action button is a part of the material design library and is used to denote the primary action in the UI, which in our case is incrementing the counter. The floating action button widget can be added inside the scaffold widget by using its floating action button parameter. Note that on adding the floating action button, the Dart analysis warns us that the onPressed parameter of the floating action button is required. On diving into the declaration of the floating action button widget, we see that the onPressed parameter is annotated as required. This annotation comes from the meta package. Note that even though the parameter is marked as required, it is still an optional parameter since it's inside the curly braces of the floating action button constructor. This may be a little confusing at first, but the whole idea behind required optional parameters is to improve the user's experience, the user in this case being the developer. When we add a floating action button, we are most likely to add an event that would trigger when we press it. Hence, the onPressed parameter is made required. Note that if we do not include the onPressed parameter, the IDE gives us a warning but doesn't really stop us from executing the code. This is because the onPressed parameter is optional and required but also nullable. In case we do not add an onPressed value, it is treated as null by default. Let's use an example of the icon button widget to understand this further. The icon button widget has two optional and required parameters, onPressed and icon. Note that in this case, if we try to run this without these two parameters, a runtime error is thrown. This red screen denotes the runtime errors, and these can also be seen in the Run tab of the IDE. Let's jump to the statement which causes the runtime issue of the icon parameter being null. Here, in the icon button constructor, we can see that both onPressed and icon are optional and required. The onPressed is nullable, which is the same as in the case of the floating action button widget. But the icon is non-nullable, as seen on the assertion statement on line 156. Hence, we need to provide an icon. Let's hot reload now. You can see that the onPressed parameter is null, and still there are no runtime issues because it is a nullable parameter. Therefore, we can also remove this and everything would still work fine, except that the IDE would keep warning us about the required parameter. There's a quicker way to learn which parameters are required. When using autocomplete for a widget, make sure that you choose the option that lists the parameters too. This would import the widget with the optional required parameters. The default color of the floating action button does not come from the primary color parameter. We can see this by changing it to green and noticing that the color of the app bar and status bar change, but the color of the floating action button does not. The default color of the floating action button comes from the primary swatch attribute of the material app widget. The main difference between primary color and primary swatch is that primary color is a single color, but primary swatch is a material color, which means that it's a collection of different shades of a color. If we scroll further down, we see that the theme data constructor uses colors.blue as the primary swatch if the primary swatch provided is null. The operator here is the null-aware assignment operator in Dart. It assigns the value on the left if primary swatch is not null, or else it assigns it the value on the right. In our case, we provide colors.red as our primary swatch, and hence it picks that up. If we remove primary swatch, it would pick colors.blue from here. Check out the link in the lesson notes to know more about Dart's null-aware operators. Similarly, if we do not provide a primary color, it picks up the primary swatch as its default value. To replicate the default app, let's provide colors.blue as our primary swatch. Coming back to the floating action button, since we haven't added an onPressed argument, it is treated as null. Therefore, we cannot tap the floating action button. This is the same as setting onPressed to null. Let's go ahead and add it using the keyboard shortcut or the yellow light bulb icon. On doing so, the floating action button becomes tappable. We see that the type of the onPressed argument is of the type void function or a void callback. A void callback is a function that has no arguments and returns no data. In Dart, functions are first-class objects, which means that even functions are objects and have a return type called function. This means that just like we can assign strings, ints, or booleans to variables, we can also assign functions to variables or be passed around as arguments to other functions. Moreover, we see that the onPressed function does not have a name. To understand this concept, let's look at the two types of functions. Most functions, such as main or build, are named functions, with the names being main and build in these two cases. However, we can create another type of function called a nameless function. An anonymous function, or sometimes a lambda or a closure, is a nameless function with 0 or more parameters. In our case, the onPressed argument takes in an anonymous function with 0 parameters, and we are executing the print statement inside the code block. For functions that contain just one expression, you can use a shorthand syntax. An anonymous function can also be further simplified and written as an expression using the fat arrow operator. More information about anonymous functions can be found on the link in the lesson notes. Further, to add the add symbol to our floating action button, let's use its child argument. The child argument is of the type widget, so we can use anything here such as a text widget, a column widget, or to replicate the default app, the icon widget with the icon data add.